Having arrived at the city of Dale, Zook and the party says their final farewells to the wagon owner, with Zook taking his entire life savings to remember him by. Wanting more specific directions to the address scribbled down on the back of the note they found on the dead man's locket, Zook leads his pet meat shields to the nearest tavern called the Royal Stallion. The entire party is collectively disappointed when they don't see a horse wearing a crown serving the drinks, but instead just a boring old dwarf. But as Zook makes his way over to the bar to have a go at some cheeky little extortion, someone else walks in the door with the same idea. The 8-foot-tall shark-like humanoid begins making his way to the bar, his every step slightly shaking the tables as he walks by. Every patron in the tavern takes a sudden interest in the bottom of their flask, and Dane and Adar quickly step aside for the party-sized gentleman. Zook stares him down, like a chihuahua staring down a mailman, as the creature that would come to be known as a sharkin proceeds to demand this week's protection money from the owner. As soon as the coin is handed over, the sharkin says nothing more, and simply turns to leave without so much as glancing in Zook's direction. After everything they've been forced to go through lately, Dane and Adar let out a sigh of relief, as it seems they have finally been spared any further need for therapy. But suddenly, as the sharkin is halfway out the door, Zook remembers his severe allergy to peace and quiet, and decides to ruin their day. As a gnome calls out to the aquatic bodybuilder, informing him that all the coin in his hand actually has Zook's name on it, the sharkin merely looks back at him with an amused smirk. Immediately able to tell he's new here, the sharkin advises the gnome to pipe down, as their sharkin gang, called the Toothtakers, has a height requirement, and in more ways than one, Zook would come up short. Not overly keen to go back to the kiddie pool, however, Zook reaches for a staff of fire, only for the tavern owner to grab his hand and stop him, allowing the sharkin to leave with a chuckle. Before the furious gnome can burn the tavern owner alive for having the nerve. The apologetic dwarf explains to him just how serious of a threat these Toothtakers are. Messing with them would be like putting your hand inside a wasp's nest, just to have some more excitement in your life. Frustrated, but having more important things to do for the moment, Zook decides to have the owner point him towards the locket owner's home in exchange for being allowed to live. At least that way he can get one thing ticked off the list before celebrating later by having shark for dinner. Thinking to himself that he ought to buy some dog leads at this point, Zook brings Dane and Adar, plus their newest little idiot, to the address where it is decided along the way that it may be best if someone other than the unhinged power-tripping psychopath is the one to break the news to a widow that her husband and father to her child isn't coming home again, and that they would like to be paid for that information. So Dane steps up to knock at the door and be greeted by the poor woman, where he decides not to drag things out and gently informs her right away that her husband has died over in Bristol. The party were anticipating various different responses to that news, but none of them had put down amused denial on their bingo cards. As they attempt to assure her that they are in fact telling the truth, she simply turns back down the hall and calls out to her husband. Suddenly, the husband himself, healthy as ever, casually pops his head around the door and comes down to join the conversation with a merry smile. The entire party feels their blood go cold as they imagine what morbid situation they have just gotten themselves into. As they hand the wife the locket and note for her to read, the husband quickly assures her that it was from a few years ago when he thought at one point he wasn't going to make it out of a sticky situation. He also apparently lost the locket there too, and is thankful to the party that they brought it back. Still a bit unsure, the wife reluctantly goes back to tend with their daughter upon her husband's insistence, while he himself invites the party to join him for drinks and talk about some payment for bringing the deer locket back to him. Despite the obvious reason for caution, the party still proceed to join him, and upon stepping inside the much more run-down tavern than the Royal Stallion, they realize that they have once again fallen for another obvious ambush, a pattern for the party that is forming alarmingly quickly. Closing the door behind them all, the husband reveals himself to be a doppelganger, a creature that can take on any humanoid form at will and stalks its prey, hunting and learning their behavior. Basically just a less unhinged version of paparazzi. And once the doppelganger has mastered the mannerisms of its prey, it kills them and takes their own form and identity for themselves. The few other patrons and the apparent tavern owner also follow the fake husband's lead, as they also reveal themselves to all be doppelgangers as well. Given how rare it is for them to work in groups, the party comes to the same conclusion that my grandmother does whenever she sees teenagers with the nerve to exist on her street. They must be up to something. A hairy fight breaks out as the doppelgangers attempt to make their identity theft seem a little bit more like identity mugging. Even with the power of Zook's Staff of Fire being able to reduce 3 of them to fire kindling via a single well-placed fireball, the remaining 2 manage to yank his staff away from him before he can do any more harm. Thankfully, the doppelgangers skipped out on magic class back in school, probably too busy interning for paparazzi at the time, so they aren't able to use the staff against them once they have it. Much like the guy who peaked in high school starting to notice his early onset balding, Zook begins to wilt without a staff, all his smug bravado disappearing, and the remaining doppelgangers are powerful enough to defeat and capture the party. The short-lived relief for not being killed right there and then is snuffed short, as the party find themselves being bound and gagged, before being roughly shoved into the back storage room, which at first did not overtly upset Nadar, until he realized that no one had given him a safe word. Knowing they wouldn't have long before the doppelgangers would return to interrogate and study them, before feeding them to the fishes afterwards, it seemed the party had no choice but to solve the world's most depressing escape room. Between making use of Kane's sharp teeth, as well as Nadar's lightning breath, they managed to get their hands free, and it seems an easy escape out the upper window of the back wall is entirely possible. However, missing his staff like my dad missed my birthdays growing up, Zook tried eavesdropping with his ear against the door, only to overhear one of the 2 remaining doppelgangers heading out on an errand for a while. Unable to resist the chance to take back his staff, Zook is keen to act now, but knows the rest of the party wouldn't jump at the chance to have the gnome reacquire his weapon of mass destruction. So, he instead manipulates them into helping him take down the doppelganger while it's alone. He argues that this will also allow them to wait and ambush the last one returning by itself too, and this would ensure they can eliminate the doppelganger threat once and for all. An easy choice, surely, for who amongst the party wants to worry about watching over their shoulders going forth, never knowing if a friendly face they encounter is actually one of these very doppelgangers planning their revenge. Successfully persuaded, the party does manage to help Zook defeat the single unsuspecting doppelganger left here alone, and the gnome quickly returns to his arrogant shenanigans the very second he gets that staff back in his hand, barking orders and making demands of the whole party yet again. Everyone helps himself to a drink from behind the bar, as they wait out the hour until the doppelganger returns to meet its fate. Sure enough, the ambush is ready and waiting by the time they hear a knock at the door. But just as Zook's fireball is charging up, pointing right at the figure walking through the door, everyone freezes at the sight of the 8-foot-tall Sharkin from earlier making his way inside, instead of the doppelganger, who clearly hasn't returned yet. After an awkward pause from the Sharkin, like your parents walking in to find you holding hands before marriage, He then quickly composes himself, facing down the blatant threat before him, and looks Zook dead in the eye before offering him the third and final warning of the day.
Do not mess with the Toothtakers.
As Zook stands there, Fireball desperately begging to be released, like cats at 3 a.m. for some bloody reason, the gnome senses the slightest hint of fear from the gang member, and, ironically, Zook reacts to the faintest hint of fear, like a shark reacts to a drop of blood in the water. Before anyone else in the party has time to stop the little psychopath, he unleashes the full power of the staff, and while not being able to kill something as powerful as a sharkin in one attack, he does manage to bring it to its knees, leaving him weak and injured already. Left with no alternative now, Dane and Adar rush to attack the injured gang member in an attempt to finish him off as quickly as possible. Just as it looks as though Dane may be able to take the sharkin down for good, Zook is quick to step in and remind his barbarian meat shield of his place, before stepping smugly up to the downed sharkin himself, savouring every moment of superiority that he feels over this otherwise powerful creature. Holding a dagger to his throat, pure glee consumes Zook's eyes as he stares into the creature's soul, and says, "You chose the wrong fight." And with a flick of the wrist, he opened the sharkin's throat. Before Zook's god complex could grow 2 sizes that day, however, the whole party noticed almost immediately after sending the sharkin to the void, a bright purple flash from outside. As a violet shade reached under the door, a sudden bellowing voice called out to them from outside.
Sounds like you lot are having a real party in there. Mind if I join in?
While the others suggest fleeing out the back window from before, Zook has already tasted victory today, and is a glutton for more. With the power of his staff in his hand, he confidently struts out the front door, with the rest of the party reluctantly following their most powerful member, if only for the best chance of surviving this entire mess. Yet as they all step outside and see what awaits them, Zook, for the first time, has his arrogant ego shaken, and his hold on the Staff of Fire almost goes limp from fear. They all find themselves standing in front of a row of 13 sharkin, with the one in the middle, front and center, standing much taller than the others, wielding a large purple, almost amethyst-looking warhammer over his shoulder, and somehow an even more terrifying toothy shark smile. Evidently a Walking Dead fan, the Negan wannabe orders the party to get down on their knees, right there in the muddy, raining street, as the last of the sunlight sinks into the ocean. There he introduces himself as Doris, the leader of the Toothtaker gang here in the city, and the one personally responsible for punishing those who hurt any of his men. Zook weighs his options over whether or not he should unleash a fireball into the crowd of them now, but evidently Doris sees the murder in the gnome's eyes, and steps forward to hop down on one knee in front of him. He lets Zook know that he can still smell the blood of his man on the gnome's hand, then proceeds to inform Zook that he's a big believer in the eye for an eye mentality. Somewhere between wanting to mock him and attempt to plead for mercy, the humbled Zook offers a hand to Doris in front of him, and after a moment's pause, Doris's smile only grows even wider, and he takes Zook's hand. Then, with the unfathomable strength of a sharkin, he crushes every last bone in the gnome's hand, crumpling it as though it were paper. Content from playing with his food, Doris then stands back up, raises the warhammer up above his head, and asks if Zook has any final words. The gnome, in agonizing pain from his crushed hand, looks with a furious and tear-filled rage in his eyes, and speaks in infernal, the language of the devils, saying, I will be back. And with that, Therese brings his warhammer down on the gnome's head, bursting it like a melon, and ending Zook's reign in one foul swoop.